Good morning and welcome back for day 2 of our symposium, The Roots of Agricultural Productivity Growth. For those of you that are just joining today, my name is Nate Kaufman and I serve as Economist, Vice President, and Branch Executive in our Omaha office of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. This agricultural symposium is an event that we've hosted on a regular basis for the last several years as a way to dive into specific topics that we think will have a lasting impact in how we think about agriculture and food. Yesterday's sessions explored, for example, some of the key drivers of agricultural productivity growth, what those drivers have been in the past, what's been the path of productivity in the past, and how that productivity growth is likely to evolve in the future. We also had some sessions devoted specifically to understanding the role of technology and data. Today's sessions will explore more broadly some of the supply chain spillovers that may start with productivity and how that productivity growth in agriculture will affect other industries that may be connected to agriculture. We'll also explore some of the environmental risks surrounding productivity growth in the future. Today, though, we will begin with a keynote address from Ertharin Cousin. Ertharin is Distinguished Fellow of Global Food and Agriculture at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, as well as a visiting scholar at Stanford University's Center on Food Security and the Environment, and CEO and founder of Food Systems for the Future, a nutrition impact investment fund. She's a global agriculture, food security, and nutrition solutions thought leader and sustainability advocate. From 2012 to 2017, Ertharin led the United Nations World Food Program, and in 2009 she was nominated and confirmed as the U.S. ambassador to the UN agencies for food and agriculture in Rome. Prior to her global hunger work, Ertharin helped lead the U.S. domestic fight to end hunger, including service as the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of America's Second Harvest, now Feeding America. Ertharin, thank you for joining us virtually today. We look forward to hearing your comments, and the floor is all yours.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Nate, for that introduction. In addition to the titles that Nate had stated during his introduction, I'm also now serving as a Robert Weisacher Fellow, and I'm coming to you this morning from Berlin, Germany. But I am delighted to participate in this important and timely dialogue, Nate. So again, I thank you for this opportunity, because as a tone setter for your discussions and presentation today, let me remind this Federal Reserve audience, even before the COVID pandemic, while the food system was and remains productive, it is not sustainable and not very agile, and in most parts of the world, not resilient. Indeed, as I will explain, problems of the food system were highlighted and illuminated during this COVID pandemic, and exacerbating food security and nutrition challenges at home and abroad. Our food system today is at the heart of our global human health and environmental crisis. Yes, our food and agriculture system is productive, particularly in the United States. However, the data supports the veracity of my statement. Specifically, before the pandemic, globally, 690 million people suffered from hunger or undernourishment, while another 650 million experience the challenges of obesity and too often the diet-related non-communicable diseases associated with obesity. In addition, globally, more than 3 billion people were and are unable to afford a healthy meal. These numbers don't just reflect the challenges in developing countries, but also in the United States, as well, where pre-COVID, 35 million Americans experienced food insecurity, including 11 million children. In the U.S., while the overall poverty rate in 2019 was 10.5%, poverty amongst white individuals was 9.1%, compared to 18.8% for Blacks and 15.7% for Latinos. 8% for Blacks and 15.7% for Latinos. I note these poverty numbers because of the direct relationship between income and lack of access to affordable nutrition. Challenges of lack of access to affordable, nutritious food. Because some 3 million college students suffer from food insecurity. The food system pre-COVID was also at the heart of our global planetary health and environmental crisis. Climate scientists warn that food systems breakdown is the biggest threat from climate change. And food systems are a major contributor to climate change, with up to 40% of greenhouse gas emissions generated by a variety of food system activities. Yet, our increasing global population requires ever-growing increases in yields, resulting in ever-increasing expansion of cultivated land. Fresh water use increases, of which 70% is consumed by food system activities, and increasing use both of nitrogen and phosphorus, with a risk of expensive and potentially irreversible environmental change. In other words, agriculture is a victim of and a contributor to our environmental challenges, creating an inextricable paradox. As if that wasn't enough, then came COVID. COVID illuminated the food system and food security challenges at home and abroad. The COVID global health response generated food system disruptions in places and in effects that many local, national, and the international community failed to anticipate, and unfortunately lacked the systems, tools, and capacity to immediately address. Some good news, though. Many feared the potential disruptions in global trade would create food scarcity, and insecurity in net importing countries, similar to the challenges last witnessed during the global food crisis in 1997. To avoid this challenging scenario in the early months of the COVID response, global leaders worked together with national governments and successfully limited export bans. Apart from a few short-lived export restrictions and some hiccups created by port delays, the global transport of commodities successfully operated throughout the COVID pandemic response, almost without interruption. The transport challenges that occurred in local and regional ports when lockdowns and curfews limited staff available to unload vessels, process cargoes, and to transport commodities to local markets. In a number of developing countries, particularly in Africa, because of lack of refrigeration, both for transport and storage, curfew restrictions requiring drivers to travel during the day resulted in increased incidents of food loss, bringing about higher food prices across the continent. Prior to COVID, because of the refrigeration and storage inadequacies, drivers moved during the night when temperatures were lower and arrival times in markets were synced to opportunities for quick offloading and sale. During the COVID response, these local restrictions resulted in increased losses of perishable fruits and vegetables across many countries, where post-harvest loss, even pre-COVID, exceeded 35%. All total, FAO analyzed the impact of the COVID-19 response on urban food systems across the globe and found 86% suspension of school meals, 68% restrictions on the selling of food in public places, 57% restrictions and or disruptions in the function of local and regional markets, 40% limits on the supply of food commodities across retail supply chains, and 60% average rises in food prices. These numbers represent global averages, and at the national level, every country across the globe maintained some level of context-specific impact. I would be remiss if I didn't spend a few minutes noting the impact the COVID response had on the malnutrition of children. UNICEF warns that pre-COVID, that the COVID response on children has increased the number of those suffering from malnutrition from the 149 million before COVID by an additional 2.6 million children. This increase will effectively reverse the 3 decades of incremental progress on childhood stunting. Here at home, just as in other nations, COVID highlighted the fragilities and lack of agility in our food system. The long lines at food banks across the nation while farmers dumped milk and plowed fields under starkly demonstrated the meaning of food insecurity when there is availability of food, but not access. The lines highlighted the economic fragility of many American households with wage earners, frontline workers, and those we refer to as essential workers, often the most vulnerable. In the U.S., dumping of milk, culling of herds, plowing under of fields evidence the disruption in our food distribution channels. Because our very efficient U.S. food system is divided into 2 production and distribution channels, one serving the retail community and the other serving institutional and restaurants operations, as well as schools and hotels. Another issue that we must recognize that drives our production and our agriculture system is that during COVID, obesity and the related non-communicable diseases of diabetes and hypertension were found to be the #1 comorbidity factor. You will recall that FAO found 3 billion people across the globe cannot afford or access nutritious meals. Today, 60% of all calories derive from the consumption of corn, wheat, rice, and soy. Indeed, in the U.S., 60% of American diets consist of low-cost, high-calorie, too often low-nutritious value processed foods. At WFP, when I was serving as executive director, we identified a growing double burden of malnutrition, with more countries adopting what was often considered an American diet and consumption habits, resulting in increases of obesity, while at the same time countries were battling hunger and undernutrition. As a result, the number of overweight and obese people exceed the number of hungry people in the world. There are approximately 2 billion overweight adults, with about 650 million considered obese. In the U.S., over 70 million adults are obese. The crisis of overnutrition is a leading contributor to non-communicable disease. In addition to the health challenges NCDs created during the COVID pandemic, global as well as national economists project that by 2030, non-communicable diseases could cost the global economy $47 trillion. So here we are, May 25th, 2021. Some 15 months from the start of this epidemic. Our masks are coming off outside, restaurants, schools, hotels are reopening, even Lollapalooza is scheduled to party on in Chicago this year. Many are asking, if we are on the other side of the crisis, why can't we just go back to business as usual, to how we operated our agriculture and food systems before COVID? As I hope you've taken away from my opening remarks, our food system before COVID was, if not broken, in desperate need of repair. In addition, the question we should ask is not if there will be another pandemic, but when will there be another pandemic? We have an opportunity to build back better. But what does this mean, to build back better? It means food systems supported by agriculture systems that are not just productive but sustainable, meaning a food system from farm to fork operates within our environmental boundaries, meets our human health needs, including access to affordable, nutritious food for all, and supports equitable economic opportunity for all actors across the entire food value chain. Ambitious, yes, yet a fully achievable outcome. If we embrace the multi-stakeholder cooperation required to deliver the policy, innovation, social engagement, and financial investments necessary for this critical transformation. We can begin this critical transformation by embracing 4 game-changing ideas. First, investments in research and innovation, including adequate public and private sector financing to commercialize adoption and scale of innovations across all food supply chains. Transforming to a more resilient and sustainable food system requires innovations which must support advancements from soil conservation through ag tech, including digital and biotech, ensuring improved seeds, crop protection, logistics, warehousing, distribution systems, plus institutional purchasing practices. Retail innovation should include increasing the scale up of e-commerce and affordable direct access to consumer purchasing, which to provide equitable access to all must include innovation in payment systems that give SNAP and other federal and local beneficiaries equitable access to any systems improvements. For an innovation example for farmers, the soil represents the present and future opportunities. From a policy perspective, government should invest in the programs and services that make it easier and more profitable for farmers to practice conservation agriculture. We also need private sector technology and financial investment, which will catalyze improvements and ensure farmer uptake of conservation practices. Also, from an innovation standpoint, new advanced plant breeding technology will potentially not only address yields and water challenges, but also offer solutions for increased nutrition, flavor, and product life cycle or functionality. Increased production through biotechnology could also address the challenge of food affordability. These new tools could also strengthen our capacity to enhance food safety and quality across the food system. But without adequate social stakeholder engagement, policies, and investments, the threat of misinformation and scientifically unfounded objections will compromise the value-added full potential these tools may represent. And as a result, the full opportunity will go unrealized. The U.S. regulatory system must not impede the investment and the development of new technologies, such as gene editing. By creating policy and regulatory environments that foster innovation in new agricultural technologies, the U.S. food system will continue to be a leader in the food and agriculture innovation space. Innovation must not stop at the farmhouse gate. Innovation opportunities for local production to local purchasing, not just to reduce the carbon footprint of food logistics, but also to make food more nutritious, affordable, and available. The second game-changing solution requiring policy, regulatory, and social engagement and financial support. We must reduce food loss and waste in an inclusive and sustainable manner. We talk about reduce, reuse, and recycle. We must also include upcycling opportunities where no food or food components are ever considered waste. We must increase the nutritional shelf and refrigeration life of our food through our food processing and packaging, including investments in the food preservation technology to deliver better quality, more nutritious food, and consumer appeal for longer periods. In the developing world, we waste 30% of all food harvested, primarily at retail and consumer household level. Policy supporting the research and investments required to deliver new tools from idea to scale will ensure we make food waste history. The third game-changing solution will require agriculture policy at global, regional, and national level, including a U.S. Farm Bill that supports transformation to a more sustainable food system. It is often stated, what we measure is what counts. Just as true, what we subsidize is what the food system delivers. The agriculture system we need for a sustainable food system include environmental and human health and supporting the economic return to all, from farmers to retailers, is the system we should support, not just from policy and regulation, but how we finance the system. The data suggests the U.S. Farm Bill subsidizes unsustainable commodity farming and livestock production. To feed a population projected to exceed 9.5 billion in 2050, we need big agriculture. But we also need a diversity of the solutions, including small and mid-sized farmers, as well as organic farmers, with all actors incentivized to adopt more regenerative, sustainable agriculture practices. This will require the tough trade-off conversations about water as well as land use that we must not be afraid to engage in order to continue to move forward to create a more sustainable food system. Before I close, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about that fourth game changer. The need to ensure any new agriculture or food-related policies recognize how racial injustice has shaped American agriculture and the food system as a whole. Always remembering that the food system does not end at the farmhouse gate, because while much contention and debate is now ongoing about loan forgiveness for Black farmers, historical racial inequities in the food system extend beyond the farmhouse gate all the way to the fork, shaping not just the paucity of opportunities for Black farmers, but other Black-owned and other minority-owned businesses along the food chain. Indeed, today, there is not one Black-owned grocery retail food chain in the U.S. We will not create the sustainable food system we need without addressing the racially based inequities of the past and ensuring opportunities for all Americans to equally benefit from the policies, programs, and any opportunities we create in the future. 4 game-changing solutions to create a sustainable food system will ensure our ability to save our planet, address hunger, and as well as malnutrition, and provide for equitable access to economic opportunity from farm gate to the fork. We know that I recently heard someone say, progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability, but only from activism and hard work. I would add that hard work will only pay off with the right policies, multi-stakeholder cooperation and action supported by adequate financial investment, both from the public sector and the private sector. No better place to talk about investments than here at the Federal Reserve. So thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, Ertharin, thank you for those comments, and we'll now turn to the audience for questions. So we've got some time for a few questions, and again, if you have a question, please submit it using the link on your screen. And Ertharin, I'll get us started here with one question, and I know you've had a lot of involvement on a global level of some of these conversations and thinking about policies. And you mentioned some of the events of the past year and the disruptions from that past year. I'm curious how that conversation has evolved on a global scale, and if you feel as though there is a sense of agreement as to what some of the priorities and needs are, or where you feel like there would be maybe the most promise in terms of a starting point for getting to some of those agreements.
Nate, thank you for that question. And yes, there has been global conversation in every quarter on how do we, and use that phrase, build back better. To ensure that we're creating a more sustainable food system. And we'll conversation in every quarter on how do we, and use that phrase, build back better. To ensure that we're creating a more sustainable food system and supporting the kinds of game-changing solutions that I talked about here today that the entire global community can embrace and support as we move forward. But there's a recognition that it can't just be about one summit, that there's attempts now to include food security and the agricultural food system changes that are necessary in the G20 conversations that are upcoming, as well as at COP26, which will happen later this year, so that we stop talking in silos about these issues and recognize that the types of policy changes that we need and investments that are required to make this transformational change will require that this is all integrated.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's a question here that builds off of some of the conversation that we had yesterday about the importance of research, and you talked about innovation, for example. And I think that you also commented on the need for private and public sector investment and partnership. I guess I'm curious if you could elaborate on that just a little bit more. Are there some places or some examples of where you think that's worked well, and what are some of the key components to that partnership?
Yes, I think that we've seen some interesting research in the area of biotech, using CRISPR to address some of the challenges. And historically, they've been much of the work has been around water and the uptake of and the requirements for less water, increasing the yield or strength of particular plants, supporting the tendency that some plants have towards particular diseases, and using gene editing to support that work. That what we're now witnessing is the commercialization of that research into new tools that will hopefully come online in the future to support farmers' access to other alternative methods for increasing agricultural productivity beyond the tools that are available to them today.
Great, thank you. We have a question here that builds off of one of your later comments that you had in terms of some of the challenges that might be required. And specifically, the question asks, how can we invite more young Black people without farming backgrounds into agriculture? Are there entities that are maybe working on behalf of young Black men and women that could potentially be interested in agriculture?
The same enterprises that work for white and Latino and Native populations. Our Forex clubs, our agricultural programs in schools are all supporting the education of the next generation of potential farmers. But we also need to ensure that we expand the access of those programs. There's been talk about creating new agricultural corps that would be similar to what we had post-World War II, that provide opportunity for those in urban areas or even those in rural areas without access to information to learn more about the agricultural system in the U.S. But we need to go beyond just inviting and ensuring more education. We need to provide more opportunity for all young farmers to have access to the loans and the finances that they need to access land. When I talk to young farmers, regardless of race or ethnic background, they talk about the lack of access to capital to purchase land. And so many of those farmers today are renting land in order to farm. And we need to expand access to capital so that those whether they're black farmers or young farmers across the board, have the ability to purchase land. But what we haven't done in the past is when we say, yes, we need to create that program to provide more opportunities for young farmers, the door has been closed too often on farmers of color. And we need to change that. And so addressing a challenge that's facing all farmers and ensuring that that opportunity has no racial barriers.
Well, Ertharin, I suspect that we could go on with questions, and there's much that we haven't gotten to this morning that I think would be nice to be able to get to, but in the interest of time, I think that we'll wrap up here. I definitely appreciate you taking time. I know that you're very busy, and also with your travels, appreciate you connecting from Berlin today. So thank you for joining this morning to kick off our second day of the symposium. Before we go to a break, Ertharin, I'll just give you a second here for the last word before we take the break.
Well, again, I thank you, Nate, I thank you for this opportunity, and to the Federal Reserve for including me in this conversation. The reality is that too often when we talk about sustainable agriculture, we focus on the agriculture and not the people. And agriculture is all about the people, whether it's the people who work on the farm or the people who consume the food that we produce. And we need to ensure that we're having one conversation that ensures that sustainability includes what products and how we operate on the farm to what we consume in our homes, and that all of it is performed in a manner that supports both the environmental sustainability, environmental health, consumer health, and provides an economic return to those farmers and every other worker along the system. Thank you.
Thank you, Ertharin. We'll be talking more about some of the risks connected to this conversation this morning, so I appreciate everybody joining.